Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks so much for being back with us on the podcast. I'm really grateful to be here with Pastor Dustin Boreland. Dustin, thanks for making time to be on the podcast today, brother.
Yeah, it's an honor, man. I'm really glad to join you.
Well, I'm really glad. I was talking to a mutual friend of ours, Mike Rosinski, and he was saying Dustin's doing his doctorate in practical theologies in post-Christian studies. This guy has experience serving and leading in Quebec, which is the most unchurched region of North America. Some people would say all of the Americas, and some incredible experience in urban settings, serving people and inviting them to encounter Christ through the gospel. So I'm pumped for this conversation. And one thing that leapt out to me in some of our earlier conversations, and I know part of your story is that as a young adult, you were like, I'm a teacher. I'm going to teach, I'm going to educate young minds. That's what I'm going to study. That's what you were working on. And now suddenly you're an associate pastor, you're working on your DPT, and you're in an entirely different vein. So I'd love to know, to start off, like, what caused that pivot? What took you from teaching in the academic world into pastoral ministry? How'd you discover that calling in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, long story shorter, I saw myself on a trajectory of academic work, specifically in Old Testament biblical studies. So I thought, nerding out about Hebrew verbs and writing in that space and studying and teaching was going to be where I landed. But my wife and I, even before we got married, we had an opportunity to enter into full-time foster care of teenage boys. And so after we got married and just as I started my PhD in Old Testament, I was going and doing doctoral work all day and then coming home to our 4 teenage boys. And it was those two worlds, I think, just a sense of dissonance or disconnect between those two worlds that led me to just pause. I paused my studies for a year right after finishing my comps for my PhD. And my wife and I just took a year to to pray and discern what God was doing, because there was all sorts of tension and disconnect there for us in what we were called to. And it was during that time that we really got some experience in kind of church planting world and missional theology, and felt a clear call to church planting. And so we ended up in Montreal shortly after that to plant and work in that context. And that's now 12 years ago. So we've been in different ministry contexts and working in that way since then. And that was kind of that was like the seed of that pastoral ministry call to the local church.
Wow. So it was right into like planting a church. And you guys, were you living in Quebec at the time, or were you based outside? Yeah. Wow.
No. So we were here in the GTA. Specifically, we were in Brampton. And then in Milton. So we had different foster homes that we actually moved into. So it was an interesting model of fostering. But it was really exposure to church planting. We were serving as part of a core team for a church plant at the time. So we weren't the lead planting team for the ministry, but we were serving. And so we started to get a taste of church planting. And it was through just starting to kind of be exposed to some other church planting networks and the missional movement that really started to give us an appetite for that. And so we got assessed. We did a couple different church planting assessments during that time, and ended up meeting some really good leaders from Montreal. And that's how we ended up spending a weekend there, just kind of checking out the city and what God was up to in Montreal. And shortly after that, started all of that church planting work and moved there and support raised and worked there. So
well, I love that, man, to not only have to be redirected in your career trajectory, but with that to be uprooted to go to a different province. That's saying yes in a big way to God's calling in your life. And I wonder, for you, man, would you say your idea of pastoral ministry 12 years ago when you started is what it still is today? Or would you say that jumping into a very post-Christian context like Montreal has really changed the way you understand the role of the pastor in North America and especially in Canada today?
Yeah, I think pastoral ministry is interesting because you get training, you get theology, and you come out thinking or feeling like you know what you're doing. But you quickly learn that you have no idea what you're doing. And
Amen
because
to that.
Yeah, and because my training was in biblical studies and not in the ministry track as well, for better or for worse, maybe I didn't have some of the baggage of like pastoral ministry training, but I also didn't have a lot of the assets. So I was thrown into a setting where, I mean, petri dishing stuff out and really figuring things out practically was that hands-on. So like, I like to think about it, like we didn't really get the university training for pastoral ministry. We just got the apprenticeship, college level, go and do it experience of local church ministry, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I would say, I think over the last 12 years, pastoral ministry is far more holistic than I would have believed, I think. And maybe far more holistic than what I would have known, in the sense that it's not just leading people. It's not simply having a vision and trying to execute it. It's not even simply rallying people on mission. But really, pastoral ministry is the formation of whole life disciples to Jesus.
Yeah.
And over the last several years of ministry, just looking at the intersection of orthodoxy, like we need right belief, we need theology, but we also need to see how that flows out into orthopraxy and how we live that out, but also in orthopathy, right? The idea of like right emotional wholeness and right feeling. And so looking at people that we're leading, that were, again, gifted by Jesus to care for holistically and to form them. I think I've learned through many mistakes and hands-on that pastoral ministry is far more holistic when it comes to the formation of people than I would have known or thought.
I was having a conversation with a missionary a few months back who'd gone to Bible college, actively in ministry overseas. And he said to me, you know, Luke, ministry has exposed in me that I'm an emotionally constipated person, which I thought was both like a hilarious way to put it, but also kind of thought-provoking. You know, someone with his degree from Bible college, et cetera, and, you know, he's learned another language and immersed himself in another culture. And yet he sees that orthopathy, that as being a really gaping hole in his own formation. So I wonder, could you double click on that in terms of, do you think our churches are emotionally healthy places, or do you think we're emotionally unhealthy contexts, or would you say it's a mix of both and this is what we're doing well in terms of emotional health and this is what we're not doing well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we've looked specifically at the last couple decades of spiritual formation, I think emotional intelligence and emotional maturity has been largely neglected. And what's happened is we've discipled people around spiritual competence instead of spiritual dependence. And so pastorally, I've noticed that even if you get the right theology, I know people that their ideas, their beliefs are so rock solid, but those things haven't yet translated and distilled out into their emotional wholeness, their emotional maturity. And so I do think it starts with us as leaders, as pastors. You know, the emotional constipation thing, I think it's brilliant, because I think over the challenges that we have come through over the last several years of planting, of church revitalization, and of leadership, I've seen a lot of emotional immaturity in myself. And I can honestly say the biggest mistakes I've made as a leader, as a pastor, haven't actually come from heresy or blatant moral failure or compromise, but emotional immaturity. Right? And I think First Thessalonians 5:23 says, may the God of peace sanctify you through and through. sanctify you completely. And so getting back to this idea of spiritual formation as the church in as a whole, as being wholly formed and having people shaped to love God with all their heart, their soul, strength, and mind, and trying to look at our churches and say, are we holistically hitting each of those areas of discipleship is just vitally important.
Wow. It makes me think of, I was talking to someone recently who has kind of been on a faith crisis journey, not the kind where it's like, I'm just going to throw out Jesus totally, but grappling with, the reality of how their faith works out in their life. And they said, I grew up and Christianity was like a three-wheeled tricycle, right? Well, all tricycles are three-wheeled, but like the front wheel, the big wheel was scripture. It was almost like God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Bible. Like this, so much emphasis, no scripture, oftentimes a very literal interpretation of scripture. And then the two smaller wheels on the back were like tradition, and then like personal experience, which he would say was like even smaller. So using that kind of illustration, would you say that emotional intelligence primarily intersects that wheel, if you will, of personal experience? And how would you foster that? Because I mean, I'll expose my bias a tiny bit here, but like, I know that often in Reformed circles, especially the Baptist tradition, we love the like super smart academic scripture people, and they've done a lot of great things. But I know I long to experience God more deeply and intimately in my whole own life. So, what would be your thoughts on that, and what does it look like to experience God more intimately in that vein?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think with the tricycle example, I think one of the missing wheels has been our spiritual dependence in community. And I think our individualism has definitely hamstrung us a little bit in this regard, where our emotional, again, you can't grow emotionally in a vacuum by yourself. And much of our spiritual formation and discipleship spaces and processes have largely been, you're right, listen to this really gifted expert unpack these amazing things that are beautiful. But now I got to go and basically out of my own effort, try to push those in, like massage those into my life, massage those into my heart, my mind. And I think community has been a missing piece there of how do we actually emotionally understand dependence on the Spirit of God, and then practice that and walk that out.
Yeah, man, great thought on that. I want to take a quick hop back to something you were saying earlier. You mentioned that you and your wife, Raquel, had stepped into fostering teenage boys, which I just came out of senior high youth ministry and I love youth, but I know like teenage boys is like, it's like a buckle up kind of season of life, right? And you're young, you're married. Did you have any kids at the time?
No,
you're just like, let's just start at teenagers. I love that.
Yeah. We did parenting backwards.
Yeah. So, but tell me about that, because I know that there is increasingly a need for fostering. It's a time in young people's lives where they're often very vulnerable, experience potentially trauma, rejection, you name it. And on the one hand, people tend to see the potential mess that could be. And yet you and Raquel are like, man, let's jump into the mess. And so I wonder, how did God lead you into that? And how did he shape you in that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so we fell into it, honestly. And providentially, like looking back, it's like, well, with God, that's not the case. He definitely called us into it. But I ended up fostering by myself for 6 months before we got married. So we were engaged to be married, and my younger sister was finishing her child and youth working degree. And she had her placement with a foster agency that specifically had homes for teenage boys and homes for teenage girls. And one day the director of the agency made a comment of how desperate they were for more foster parents, in particular men, because they did have, again, many women who were stepping into spaces. And she mentioned me. She's like, well, my big brother is really good with youth. He's coached lots of things over the years. He's coached boxing and martial arts and basketball and whatever. And I ended up having lunch with the director of the agency, and I unintentionally walked away from lunch with a job as a full-time foster dad.
Oh, wow. When you're going for sandwiches and that's a significant lunch.
And so I was actually in the process of writing my master's thesis, and I had a couple part-time jobs on the side just to kind of, pay for coffee, basically. And then I had this opportunity, and I called my wife on her lunch break. And this is remember, we're getting married in 6 months. I called her and said, I just had this weird lunch. And we have this opportunity to be foster parents. And here's what it looks like. And she said, call him back and say yes. Wow. And it was just like, what? So that not what I expected from her desire as a newlywed couple going into a space where we're going to now raise 4 teenage at-risk teens, right? So I think for us, though, the way that we were wired and kind of brought into it, I come from a very blended family. So single mom, I ended up radically saved when I was 6, and married my stepdad, who again always loved the Lord. And I have 2 half siblings that are younger than me out of that marriage. And then we also ended up raising my cousin. Because my aunt is an addict. And so I have a very blended family with all sorts of levels of trauma and dysfunction, and saw God really use that. And my wife, she grew up in Kingston, Jamaica. And so her exposure to the trauma of poverty, some of those other real needs in the community there wired her for this as well. And so I think honestly, Luke, for us, we both had this kind of undercurrent, even though we didn't know what it was or what it would lead to. I think for us, it really was just experiencing God's heart for the fatherless, and understanding a whole dimension of the gospel that really, when you look at the heart of the gospel, it's God's heart for the fatherless. And it's that, again, James 1:27, that pure religion is to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. And we had the opportunity to do that in a really tangible way. So we have stories for days and lots of very, wild experiences for sure. But we have amazing stories as well of over those 6.5 years being able to be in the lives of those teenage boys and create homes for them as they were coming out of spaces and experiences where they didn't have that.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. That's super awesome. So you go from that journey, that initial experience of you're married, you're jumping right into fostering those guys. As you shared earlier, God's moving in your heart and pointing you towards living on mission in a context where you can say, hey, we want to plant a church. We want to be a light in this. And obviously that leads you to Quebec, which I love, because just an aside, because you grew up in the GTA, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, but your wife grows up in Jamaica, and then you end up together in Quebec. I just love, so much diversity in different contexts. You got a wealth of experiences to draw on, man. But, this maybe veers a bit more towards your current academic studies, Dustin. But, people talk about Quebec as, I think, in the 60s being the most religious, you could say, region of North America, densely Catholic. And over the course of the following 3 to 4 decades, kind of flips upside down, so that there's just very little religious presence, even just like Catholic presence. And so a lot of people point to Quebec and say, this is the most post-Christian context, like on the continent. And so you're jumping into it. Montreal, biggest city, launching a church, interacting with people who have long ago shut the door on any form of faith that's remotely connected to Jesus. And so I'd love to know, like, what did you discover in that context where people have known faith and have said, nope, we're good. Like we're turning our back on that. What did you discover in terms of building relationships, sharing hope, communicating the gospel in a way that people weren't just like, oh, don't talk to me about Jesus, but actually said, wow, I need this?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think, I feel like lately, post-Christian has become a bit of a buzzword, right? And it seems like there's several parts of North America who are arguing about who's most post-Christian. But I do think Quebec, because of its complicated history, like you said, because religion and the Catholic faith in particular was so embedded as a foundation for their culture. There was this, it's called the Quiet Revolution that happened throughout the 60s and into the 70s in Quebec, where it was really a stripping of that rhubarb kind of under that rebar under the foundation of their culture. And then it was like, well, how do we fill that vacuum? And so then you have this strong secularization that happens, which leads you with a post-Christian cultural influence. So whereas Christianity was a major culture former and shaper of in that province, it becomes no, we want to reinvent our self-identity and our values and our morals around a new story, something altogether. So I think for us, looking at that and understanding the need there is what drew us there. And also, now that I'm back in Ontario and back in the GTA, I honestly think, Luke, that the rest of Canada has a lot to learn from Quebec in what's happening right now and some of the efforts that the church is making and some of the missional work that's being done there. And I honestly think I had the opportunity to like almost do ministry in a time machine, where I think that if we want to know what many cities in Canada will look like in about 15 or 20 years, we can look to Quebec.
Wow. Yeah.
And the reason why is because Quebec actually, because of its French heritage, its European heritage, Quebec actually follows Europe more than it follows Canada.
Really? I can see that.
Yeah. And so right now, if you're paying attention to a lot of the post-Christian literature and research and kind of the anecdotal stuff that's happening in European cities, it's very similar to what has happened in Quebec and specifically in Montreal as an urban center. So that poses lots of challenges, of course. I think if I was to give a couple things that we learned and ways that we saw like effective for speaking about the gospel and then like really enculturating it. The first thing I would say is prioritizing and practicing hospitality was vital. And that was really the thing that opened up the door to even get to the gospel. Because when you're working in a culture where there had to be a deconstruction of their self-identity, you need to create spaces where they're safe to explore, again, who they are already and their self-understanding, and then actually get into, well, the gospel's better. It's more beautiful and it meets those needs. And so I think hospitality became a huge priority for us in how we really structured our space and then how we trained our people, where it was like, don't stop inviting people to things, but maybe invite them to your dinner table and to your sofa before you invite them to our Christian thing.
Yes.
And so training them around that and getting them to think, well, we are actually the outsider now. So how do we enter into spaces where we can spend time and show love of stranger and again, look at outsiders and insiders and understand that. And the table being the space where we could actually do that most effectively. And so I think we saw the need to invite people into our lives before we expected them to invite us into theirs.
Right.
And that was massive. And being able to prioritize hospitality as the way that we do that. I think Henry Nouwen said, like, the job of Christians is to offer spaces where strangers can cast off their strangeness and become human again. I think that hospitality and recentering the table and our home as the main space where we can cast off strangeness and become fellow humans again will continue to be a major way that we see mission done in post-Christian cultural settings.
And which is beautiful, because sometimes when a ton of ink is being spilled on what rights we have or don't have, like, you can always be hospitable. You can always welcome people into your home and have a heart-to-heart conversation. Go ahead. What were you going to
That's
say?
it. Yeah. And I would say too, you're exactly right. I think as culture grows, not only post-Christian and secular, but also sees the Christian story and message as actually oppressive or repressive to their sense of self and the values and morals. I think actually the safest space that we'll have for freedom of speech is at the dinner table. And so I think rather than looking at the hostility of post-Christian culture and then trying to figure out how we can continue to be the loudest voice, in the cultural halls of power, it's like, well, actually, why don't we recenter the table and see that as the most appropriate space to share authentically and truthfully the beauty of the gospel, and then have that be where we have freedom of speech again with our neighbors and our post-Christian coworkers and friends and colleagues.
Oh, there's so much you've just said there, man. I'm like, so there's been a lot of Christians shouting in the last few years and demanding power and rights and like, this is who we are, and wanting, I think, to use rules and laws to try and force people to toe a certain moral line. So can you double click on that and help our listeners understand then, so what kind of shift in perspective in terms of what we're ambitious for, needs to take place in the hearts and the minds of Jesus followers, because shouting, in my mind, stopped working a long time ago.
Yeah, amen. You're right. And I think, and I'm really thankful. I am thankful for the last couple of years of strangeness and some of the pruning and some of the burning off of dross of kind of what we've seen in Christendom has happened. But I agree. I think there's a lot of learning that we will need to do coming out of, really getting back into ministry context and cultural contexts after what COVID, really did expose. I would say first and foremost, I think we need to abandon the false idea that the mission of the church is a culture war, and understand that in a post-Christian setting, as exiles, as those who are no longer at the center, but are now in the margin, our call, faithfulness, isn't, again, shouting or being in the cultural halls of power, but our call is to actually cultivate a counterculture, not an anti-culture. That's the difference, is that when we're still fighting for the center, it's that we still think that a counterculture is an anti-culture. And I would say the difference is that an anti-culture is defined by who or what we're against, whereas a counterculture is defined by who and what we're for.
Yeah. And
then we move towards that. And the whole posture is different when that's the case. And so I think that's super important for us to learn and glean from these last couple of years. But I also think that the church needs to understand that we can only engage culture by being a culture. We have to think more, be more thoughtful about what kind of culture are we forming, and is it an anti-culture or a counterculture? And then what are the alternatives that we are going to offer to our post-Christian culture, morally, what we do with our money, our bodies, our minds, all of that. And I think that so much of the church, money, material things, and sexuality, and relationships, and politics, and success, the exact same as our culture. And then we wonder why we're not having more influence. And I think it's that if we're not forming a counterculture where our ethics and our values and our rhythms are different, we won't be able to actually present an alternative. And so we can yell as loud as we'd like, but if we're not actually cultivating that countercultural identity, I just think that we're going to continue to be just yelling into the dark, and not actually gaining any ground in the influence that we can have in a post-Christian setting.
Yeah. Dude, everything you're saying, Dustin, is so on point. And my guess is that for so many people listening, you're awakening something in them through what you're saying, because there is this longing to say, I want to follow Jesus into creating culture, if you will, that is true, but is also good, and is beautiful and is kind. And so obviously that's swerving into the space of practical theology, right? Like, how do we understand our faith, not just on Sunday mornings or in reading dense, good, but very cerebral theological tomes? How do we actually wade into the waters, that roll up our sleeves, get our hands dirty in the beautiful and messy reality that is practical theology? You know, how does the average person who's a lawyer or teacher or a plumber or a stay-at-home dad or mom, how do they understand what it is to be culture makers in whatever context God has called them to, in a broader setting that is very much post-Christian?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in practical theology, I mean, what all practical theology is trying to do is it's studying the application of theological insights in practice. And so it's saying, well, what's not just primarily important what we believe and the theological commitments we make. What actually is of equal value is the fruit that those theological ideas produce. And so it's the idea that the theology that matters the most isn't simply the theology we profess, but actually the theology we practice. So if your theology and the beliefs that you hold is making you more grumpy, less generous, more apathetic to the needs of people around us, less concerned for justice for the fatherless and the orphan and the widow, might I propose that you may have the wrong theology. So practical theology tries to get at exactly that, is what can we learn from our theological commitments by the way that we're practicing them in community as the church. And so what our ministry settings, our personal lives, what is that made up of? And how does that not only show me what my theology already is, but how does that encourage me to reflect again on my theological commitments? And why I think practical theology is definitely a methodology that's going to continue to help us for post-Christian realities is because it pushes us past, it forces us very uncomfortably, but it forces us past this like Cartesian trance we've been in, right? From Descartes, like this Cartesian idea of like, I think, therefore I am, right? Practical theology really forces us past that into, no, like theology informs living. And that practice and how we understand our beliefs actually should refine our theology. Right. And so I think, I mean, Willard in like this random article he had that never, I think ever got published, said theology must be in the service of the ordinary life of ordinary people. And I think practical theology is really trying to dig deep into that reality. And encourage us and challenge us as the church to actually get back to the fruit of our theology and thinking through, what are my beliefs actually making me into? And who am I becoming as a result of that? And I think that is the question. And that's the question that needs to be answered for all of us in our Christian lives, but specifically for us in leadership, of who are our people becoming? And how do we understand that? And how do we understand the telos of that, like the end result, and then cast that shadow back and then sit with the uncomfortable reality that we might need to change some of the things that we're doing or the way that we're doing them.
And what's beautiful in the midst of that is you think about, I remember someone teaching on Jesus' command to love your neighbor. And he's like, aren't you glad Jesus doesn't say, you love your neighbor by, you have to make them cookies, or you have to watch their favorite sport, which could be professional croquet, even though it's mind numbing for you. Or like, he just says, love your neighbor. And then you get to be creative and innovative on that. But yeah, that's one of the things that always leaps to mind when these conversations come up about practical theology. I love that, Dustin. What do you believe, and how is that forming who you are becoming? So in that, and you touched on this a second ago, that there are some things in the church that need to change. And the pandemic kind of forced churches to make certain changes, probably more in the digital engagement space, maybe more than any others. But I think the pandemic also revealed like who's in, and the people that were kind of on the fringes, and maybe church was more of a social club than anything. That allegiance or lack thereof was exposed a little bit. Not to condemn those people, but to say, hey, those are the people we actually want to not just have back for the sake of butts and pews, but actually see transformed by the gospel. But it seems sometimes like there's this tug of war going on where churches are saying, this is what we've done, and this is what we'll do because of what we've done, and it worked. And other churches saying, we need to throw out 100% of what we've done and start from scratch and do everything new. And I know there's this quote, I'm pretty sure it's an Andy Stanley quote, where he says, date the model, but marry the mission. And so when you think about the church today, what would you say are some of the key models that the church needs to say, hey, you've done a great job, you've served your purpose, but we're going to move on from that? And then on the flip side, what would you say are some of the things the church needs to say, we're going to embrace these? And not just the church in terms of pastors, but Christ followers saying, we're going to start intentionally pursuing these new models in order to more effectively carry out the mission.
Yeah, that's huge. It's a huge question. I think before we are ready to answer that question around models and methodology, and even reevaluating models, I think we need a better understanding of how people are already being formed. Where we need to understand that everyone is in a process of spiritual formation. Right. So before we even understand, like, when we get our people and thinking about how do we shape our people, we need to give a lot of thought to how are our people already being formed and counterformed, really. I mean, everyone's being spiritually either formed for the better or spiritually deformed by the rhythms of their life and how they engage content and media and digital things versus analog things, and all of that shaping our people. And so I think we need to give more, and I'm thankful that there's more attention given to that. Jay Kim, in his book Analog Christian and Analog Church, I think is one of the most helpful voices I've found so far on this. I also think others who are writing about a rule of life and getting back to these ancient practices for our very postmodern, post-digital age, I think are really helpful. But I would say, I think when we think about models, I think number one, we need to reevaluate the attractional and event-centric of church programming and teaching. Because, and again, I understand the value. We have to be careful not to just throw everything out, right? Throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to understand that the attractional model really relied on a social capital of a Christian culture to draw from that pool and then remind people of a story that they were already familiar with and why they need to live into it more, right? And so that was the attractional model it succeeded at that.
Right.
However, it's not the case anymore.
Right.
It's not the case anymore that people actually have familiarity story, that we're actually starting with a very missionary enterprise of people actually don't know the Christian story.
Right.
And they may be coming with lots of preconceived ideas of the Christian story that we actually need to deconstruct first before we're even able to get them into a space where we can now introduce them to the core of the Christian story. And so I think that encourages us to think more intentionally about spaces, about events, about programs, and about spaces. And we want to think more about environments and less about events. And I think in a post-Christian culture, especially in this very decadent that we're in, if we think we can compete with like the multi-million-dollar budgets of with our pennies, I just think there's so much digital white noise and so many environments and experiences that are going to be done better than we ever could, that we need to pull back and go, okay, how do we actually create environments that are being missed by our digital age? How do we get back to some of these almost ancient, slower paced, thoughtful spaces?
Yeah.
I was reading it's a random article by AJ Swoboda recently. I mean, he's written some really great books for the church, but it was a random academic article he wrote, and he's talking about how preaching might need to be thought of differently because of the aesthetic society that we're in. And the idea that like doctrine, just teaching and doctrine and monologue has grown dull. And when people can like get on YouTube or watch TED Talks or look at debates that are done so well, polished and so well done, the content is rich and the presentation is top notch. Maybe we need to rethink some of the ways that we're executing on how we're delivering too. And so I would say that this forces us to get back to the beauty of the Christian faith, to actually understand that instead of win my mind and you'll get my heart, that I actually think we need to we need to live into the culture of, well, like, get my heart and then maybe you'll get my mind. So I've been given a lot of thought to like just spaces and what are we doing with people when we get them, and how are we forming them towards the beauty of the gospel, not just answering the questions, is this true, but answering the questions of, is this good? Beautiful.
Can I ask then, just as we reach the end of our conversation, we as followers of Jesus are building our lives around the story of Jesus and letting that story shape us and pursuing that story shaping us. So would you be able to give us maybe just a really like cookies on the bottom shelf, easy to access level example of what it looks like to interact with somebody who's building their life around an alternate story? Maybe it's a post-Christian secular cultural story that says the church is outdated and repressive or something, and how you might speak into someone's life and say, this is actually a story, the story of Jesus, that is worth laying down every other story for.
Yeah, that's great. I think this is where retooling church life and church spaces around formation and not just merely information is vital. Because I think what we're realizing in our decadent society, we're also growing more superficial. And the church has an opportunity to anchor people who the most of their week superficial and aesthetic and about creating an image. We actually have an opportunity to anchor people, not just with more, but with deeper. Because I think our people, even the way that we look at our current people, forgetting, not thinking about how to be missional for the people we don't yet have, but our people need not just more, they need deeper. Because I think what we've seen out of kind of discipleship and the fruit, going back to the practical theology, is the reality that you can know something, but not understand it. And so we need to lean into spaces where formation and who people are becoming is the aim. And the Christian story gives us exactly that. The gospel is truly good news. And it's the beautiful news that we get to not just know things about God, but delight in him, delight in who he is. And I would say the way that we can do that better is by listening better. And I think that would be the last thing that I would say about kind of these post-Christian conversations, that we really do need to be slower to speak and quicker to listen. And question people's answers to things about life before we try to answer their questions. And it's in that entry point that we'll start to see beautiful opportunities to share the hope of the gospel. That as we grow more fluent in the gospel, because we need that, we need to know the theological truths of the gospel, but we also need to know the stories of culture and be equipped to speak the hope and the beauty of who the God of the gospel is and who he wants us to become in his image.
So well said, Dustin. I know for people that are listening in on this, they're going to want to say, man, we'd love to connect. We'd love to learn more about what you're doing, especially the ministry that you're a part of. And so where can people connect with you or learn more about the ministry you're leading?
Yeah, well, I've written 0 books. I hope that maybe my doctoral work will be something helpful. So look out for that. But if I'm serving at Springvale Church, just north of Toronto. And so if you go to springvale.org, some of what we're working on for discipleship spaces and some of the teaching that we're trying to get around that will be available there. I'm working on something called Springvale Institute, which will give us a space to petri dish some of that out, not just for our local church, but for the church at large. And then I tweet a little bit. So sometimes if I have something witty, I'll throw that up on Twitter. But all the normal social media outlets can be found on that, and you can slide into my DMs, and I would appreciate that.
Yeah, would love to connect online. Perfect. Well, this has been really helpful for me, and I know it's super helpful for our listeners. So thank you so much, Dustin. Really, really am grateful to you for this time.
Yeah, appreciate it.